only time endures. Instead of resisting, architecture can produce new meanings through the simultaneous processes of growth and decay. When a fragment is more compelling than when part of a whole, this presence only in absence allows for coxing of temporalities. And while the Romantic ruin served as an accommodation between distinct nature and culture, that divide is now rapidly dissolving. This is a story of the life of architecture unfolding over time. We begin with folly, an implicit desire for escape, if only to the end of the garden, E.J. Archer. As described by Vidler, folly is a figure of unreason, close to madness, a necessary evil, and not so secret harbinger of the impossible desired. A most unwelcome thing, at best sublime, and at worst frivolous. The positive emblem of the greatest horror, of the most extreme cruelty, of the most decadent eroticism, of the absolute decay. The folly competition allowed me the freedom to explore issues of time and decay through folly's unique history. Decay is aestheticized in Regel's Cult of Age Value from 1903. A necessary and lawful decay revealed an imperfection, a lack of completeness, a tendency to dissolve. The reign of nature, including those destructive elements considered part of the constant renewal of life, is granted equal standing with the creative rule of man. The Cult of Age Value condemns heinous interferences with nature's lawful act of disintegration. The pure, redeeming impression of natural orderly decay should not be diminished by man's arbitrary additions. Aesthetic satisfaction is derived not from preservation, but from the continuous and unceasing cycle of change in nature. Age Value addresses the emotions directly. Weathering is perhaps decay's softer, more accepted sister. Mostafavi and David Leather-Barrow describe weathering not just as a destructive element, but as enhancement. Finishing ends construction, weather constructs finishes. It is benign or tragic or both. At Palazzo del Te, described as architecture wearing its own death mask, Romano anticipated deterioration. The smooth surfaces of the exterior and the nearly unformed surfaces of the grotto imply simultaneous completion and deformation. Staining, antithetical to modernism's whiteness, can also be a kind of aesthetic deterioration that adds to a building's completeness. This also alleviates effort poured into maintenance. At the Brion Cemetery Chapel, Scarpa punctured the parapet, allowing rainwater to bleed through and leave a dark vertical stain in the center of a tall, austere wall. This marking tells of temporality through weathering. The mouth kisses, the mouth spits. No one mistakes saliva of the first for the second. Second, there is nothing necessarily impure about dirt. Mostafavi and Leather-Barrow. The facade of Marcel Breuer's department store in Rotterdam is more compelling because of its collected dirt. Dirt becomes ornament. Jason Payne's Raspberry Fields, an abandoned schoolhouse in rural Utah, accelerates weathering through the exaggeration of the radically different weather patterns affecting each facade. Sylvia Lavin describes, the house prickles with paranoid alertness, at least on one side. Payne did not leave weathering up to weather. The effects on wood of wind, water, and temperature are artificially amplified to such a degree that they leave the milieu of natural architecture. While the shingles on the side of the house facing town appear normal, the shingles on the wild side curl up to expose their iridescent underbellies. The inevitability of decay. It is not uncommon for architects to design with weathering effects such as patina's in mind. Often this weathering is intended to affect only the building's skin. Few architects today, however, seem to accept decay in their work, much less as a part of their work. Creators of even temporary installations believe their work will survive through photographic documentation, and thus, in the words of Levius Woods, find sanctuary in the denial of decay. Entropy, however, is inherent in materials and systems, and escapes even the most careful maintenance. Woods acknowledges this inevitability of decay, proposing that the less common and the more difficult alternative is to acknowledge, even celebrate decay from the start. This acceptance of inevitable ruin places architecture in a position to inform our understanding of the human condition and enhance its experience. Woods ultimately calls for architects to include in design a degree of complexity, even of contradiction, embodied in the simultaneous processes of growth and decay in our buildings that heightens and intensifies our humanity. Here, Gandhi envisioned for stone his Bank of England in a state of future ruination. In a culture that celebrates youth, perhaps the desire to not age is also imposed on our architecture. But aging is life, it's a story, and architecture can tell that story. The uncanny nature of Agatha Dick's work speaks through narrative temporality. This consideration of temporality is found in the works of artist Andy Goldsworthy and Robert Smithson. For Goldsworthy, each work grows, strays, decays. The challenge is not simply to wait for things to decay, but to make change an integral part of a work's purpose, so that if anything, it becomes stronger and more complete as it falls apart and disappears. It doesn't feel at all like destruction. Some works transform simply as the sun moves across the sky. Others are but captured fleeting moments. When I make a work, he explains, I often take it to the very edge of its collapse. I need to make works that anticipate but do not attempt to predict or control the future. In order to understand time, I must work with the past, the present, and the future. Total control can be the death of a work. While Goldsworthy as an artist is freer to push the boundaries of collapse than an architect, perhaps architecture has something to gain from these concepts. Smithson's work is less digestible, unapologetically ugly even in his flow series. Concrete pour, glue pour, and asphalt run down. These flows are, as described by Nancy Holt, entropy made visible. Smithson's description of entropy is dystopian. Energy is more easily lost and obtained, and that in the ultimate future, the whole universe will burn out and be transformed into an all-encompassing sameness. His most well-known work, Spiral Jetty, unexpectedly re-emerged decades later. The black basalt transformed by the incrustation of salt from the Great Salt Lake. The water not only rises and falls, it is constantly changing colors. Smithson selected the site because of the bacteria and algae that turn the water into a blood-like hue. Spiral Jetty is ever-changing. In conjunction with his land art project, Smithson wrote essays on the ruinous state of the modern American landscape. In a tour of the monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, Smithson describes on the edge of a dying industrial town, a contemporary eternal city, a utopia minus a bottom, a place where the machines are idle and the sun has turned to glass. While classical landscape parks use artificial ruins to illustrate the sublime transience of human creations, Smithson photographed industrial relics to illustrate the same vulnerability to natural forces in a provocative new way. Buildings rise into ruin before they are built. This concept of ruins in reverse describes when construction and dissolution become indistinguishable from one another. Memory traces of an abandoned set of futures. At Hotel Palenque, Smithson recorded Mayan ruins, for which Palenque is famous, but only as a distant possibility of a view from one of the hotel windows, now obscured by time. Hernan Diaz Alonso expresses accelerated decay literally through the use of ephemeral flowers. These agents of contamination provide not only an element of temporality, but also color, scent, and a connection to cultural roots. Architecture isn't timeless, but time is an important element. Relating issues of temporality to our own mortality, Alonso also prefers graceful decay and renewal over plastic surgery. Decay is but one of the many effects of time. Why is decay so alluring? Therein lies a rich history of ruin lust. Derrida wrote, once the love of ruins, a narcissistic melancholy, a memory and mourning of love itself. How to love anything other than the possibility of a ruin, than an impossible totality. Love is as old as this ageless ruin, at once originary, an infant even, and already old. The ruin is not in front of us. It is neither a spectacle nor a love object. It is experience itself. Before ruin lust swept the 18th century, ancient ruins were either sites to be pillaged or nuisances. while 18th century artificial ruins evoke the terror of the sublime and the playgrounds of the rich, 19th century romanticism was picturesque. Rather than ravaging the works of men, nature was perceived as welcoming architecture back into our harmonious whole. There is a dark side of ruins, however, that should not be romanticized. To delight in the aspects of sentient ruin might appear a heartless pastime, and the pleasure, I confess, shows a note of perversity. Henry James. We need only think of Hitler's architect Albert Speer, who, like Sohn, built with a vision of future ruin, but here as a means to create a powerful Third Reich empire. Lebbeus Woods warns, the evocative power of ruins has worked to produce powerful emotions, often for ideological, religious, and political purposes, making the motives exploitative at the least. Walter Benjamin's Angel of History gazed at the destruction from war. In cases of such violence, does the aestheticization of ruins trivialize horror and human suffering? Addressing destruction from natural disasters, Michael S. Roth writes, culture is dependent on a stable nature. Premature ruins have an uncanny effect, like gray hairs on the head of a youth. Have the regular rhythms of nature been replaced in our time by the enormity of our capacity for ruination? The cult of age value, too, condemned man's violent destruction of monuments, such massive ruin, as an unspeakable interference to natural decay. Of decaying buildings returning to the natural landscape, Roth describes, ruins here signal mortality. They point to a deep belonging of the natural world, a world that is less our inevitable tomb than our eternal home. Ruins signal the loss of a once brilliant present and the irreversibility of time. Why are ruins relevant? We live, though we might say we have always lived, in a time of ruination. The ruin is a site not of melancholy mourning, but of radical potential. Brian Dillon. Ruins still affect aesthetics and philosophical thought, and they have as much power today to shake us into wakefulness as they did in the 18th century. Furthermore, life continues after humans disappear. After the tragedy at Chernobyl, the abandoned city of Pripyat has been taken over by growth with surprising rapidity. Modern ruinophilia. Off the coast of Nagasaki lies a small fortress-like island named Gunkanjima. Ringed by a seawall and covered in tightly packed buildings, Gunkanjima was developed in the early 1900s to mine its rich coal deposit. For almost the next century, a city sprouted around the mine. When it closed, the island was deserted and has now been uninhabited for more than 40 years. These images capture the narrative power of temporality. For the photographers of these photos, Detroit is an American city in a state of mummification. Its splendid decaying monuments are no less than the pyramids of Egypt, the Colosseum of Rome, or the Acropolis of Athens, remnants of the passing of a great empire. The pejorative term ruin porn has been recently used to describe voyeuristic fascination with Detroit's lost grandeur. The criticism is a particularly American one, perhaps because the U.S. is less used to the presence of ruins. Maybe ruins, as symbols of failing and lost hopes, violate national positivity. As a counterpoint to Detroit ruin porn, other photographers document the living side of the city, and artists and designers find new opportunities for rebirth. In Ruinophilia, Svetlana Boym writes, a tour of ruin leads you into a labyrinth of ambivalent temporal adverbs, no longer and not yet, nevertheless and albeit, that play tricks with causality. The fascination for ruins is intellectual but also sensual. Ruins give us a shock of vanishing materiality. Contemporary ruinophilia dreams of potential futures rather than imaginary pasts. They do not merely signal decay, but also a certain imaginative perspectivism in its hopeful and tragic dimension. Ruinophilia is not merely a neo-romantic malaise. The pace of modern time precipitates both construction and destruction, sometimes including temporal duration. Modern ruins are poignant because they are belated and contemporary at once. The abandoned ruin offers a quest for reenchantment. Borrowing these qualities, my studio project became an exploration of collapsing temporalities. I believe architecture can answer Levi-Strauss's call to create new meanings through accepting simultaneous processes of growth and decay. Ruin literally means collapse. When a fragment is more alluring than the original whole, its incompleteness in the present alludes to a past and a future yet to come. Decay, just one of the many effects of time, can also be its antithesis, growth. In my experimental models, the forms act as armatures for different processes to take place. The aesthetic is partly a byproduct of these processes, melting, dissolving, growing, and crystallizing. Can architecture serve as a metaphorical whale fall? A carcass of a whale sunk into the ocean floor, creating complex localized ecosystems. Unlike in shallow waters where scavengers will consume a carcass quickly, the whale fall supplies sustenance for deep sea organisms for a time period as long as in a whale's natural lifespan. Nature as paint. Lichen for Skyscrapers, a project by Elizabeth Demeray, addresses the lack of native vegetation in cities by culturing lichen on the sides of skyscrapers. Once propagated, it actually forms a protective barrier. Scientists of the Spanish University are developing a biological concrete, a living patina that transforms with each season. The concrete's biological layer collects and stores rainwater, providing a damp environment where microalgae, fungi, lichen, and moss can quickly grow and thrive. And then there's the inorganic. Errors in the copper sulfate crystallization process enhance the effect in Roger Horn's seizure, a blue crystal chamber inside a condemned London flat. As J.J. Charlesworth describes, unlike the romantic ecological narrative, seizure negates the human. Autogenerative, independent of human intervention and human touch, it explores the metaphorical potential of the inorganic and the strange life of inhuman processes. The reclamation of industrial ruins is an extensive topic in itself. One model, Duisburg Nord, is rich with layers of cultural memory and integrated nature. Rather than starting with a tabula rasa, Latz and partner intertwined disused industrial artifacts with new plant life, transforming the decommissioned blast furnace into a recreational landscape park. The closing of the furnace left behind a polluted wastegate, accented with turbines and cooling towers, while other competition entries proposed classical ideas of French and English parks. Building such utopic visions meant erasing the history of the place. Latz, however, was interested in the anti-spaces and equated burying a historical site under a picturesque garden to negating the anti-world. Influenced by Orsino's Garden of the Monsters, Latz envisioned the Duisburg blast furnaces, simultaneous memory structures, as reincarnations of the ancient mythological dragon of Bomarzo. While the early modernists separated nature and technology, Latz developed Duisburg Nord as both highly artificial and highly ecological. This has nothing to do with the need for harmony, he explains. I am absolutely allergic to the idea that nature is triumphing over technology. We have to keep a hold on technology and integrate it into our environment. Swaths where plant life took over on its own form untamed lush gardens amidst the ghosts of a once blooming industry. Nature is liberated, but in some areas it is carefully controlled. And ever present in the design is the importance of memory and temporality. Post-human nature. Nature has transformed the work of art into material for her own expression, as she had previously served as material for art. Simmel's ruin, an accommodation between distinctly separate nature and culture, speaks of romantic notions. Nature has traditionally been defined as the born, and culture as the made. As evocative as ancient ruins are thousands of years old organisms still alive today. I personally find nature in its traditional sense more powerful and more moving than architecture. Therein lies a mystery that architecture cannot quite emulate. But there is an ambivalent relationship between human and natural temporalities. As Paul Rabineau describes, nature has not been natural in the sense of pure and untouched by human works for millennia. More provocatively, nature's malleability offers an invitation to the artificial. As Sylvia Levin suggests, perhaps it is no longer useful for architecture to distinguish culture from nature. Culture is a part of nature, nature is a part of culture. Looking through a post-human lens, we can start to reconsider the divide. This drawing from 1709 illustrates the three natures, as later described by John Dixon Hunt. A far-off mountain, first nature, as wilderness, gives way to agricultural land, second nature as cultivated landscape, and then a formal garden, third nature. Ecologic studios, cyber gardens, and eco-machines perhaps fit in a realm of fourth nature. Their work deploys digital technologies as a means of developing hyper-realities, regimes of intense exchange between the artificial and the natural, the designed and the accidental. Next Nature. The Next Nature Foundation, a design and think tank based in Amsterdam, proposes new meanings for nature and culture. The born and the made are shifting. They explain, the impact humans have had on the planet cannot be underestimated. Although many people have tried to improve our relationship with nature, few have asked, what is nature? The naive notion of nature as static and balanced is up for reconsideration. While technology and nature are traditionally seen as opposed, they now appear to fuse or even switch places. We must no longer see ourselves as an anti-natural species that threatens nature, but perhaps as catalysts of evolution. Nature is a dynamic force that evolves along with biological and man-made processes. From animals to atoms to the climate, humans are increasingly able to manipulate natural processes. Few parts, perhaps outer space, the deep sea, and South Pole remain unaffected. At the same time, our culture and technology are becoming more complex and difficult to control, functioning more like organisms than like inanimate things. Next nature, or culturally emerged nature, is a nature caused by people. Next nature offers a new philosophy to see the world and to design, while it shies away from judgments on which form of nature is more valuable. It opposes species loss and habitat destruction, arguing that increased diversity is always more desirable. Can future technology pave way for architecture to be born rather than built? To grow and age like an organism? Metabolic materials with properties of living systems are being developed for architectural purposes. One possibility is for self-repairing architecture and living buildings to heal stressed ecologies. Less in the realm of science fiction are the hundreds-of-year-old living bridges in India. They are made using the principles of guided growth from the roots of an Indian rubber tree. Taking 10 to 15 years to become fully functional, root bridges strengthen over time to become extraordinarily resilient. A post-human ecological lens offers a less anthropocentric view. I became interested in architecture not just for humans, but for other species, folly not as pavilion, but as nutritive structure, allowing the decay to serve an ecological purpose as it integrated into the environment. Ned Donnington, editor of Animal Architecture, addresses issues of how to design with non-humans in mind. He believes the challenge is in listening and building towards a common multi-species language. Despite all of our individual and species-specific traits, it is possible to understand certain global factors that have significance across animal types. As designers, we can actively invite other species, flora or fauna, to affect architecture in intriguing ways over time, heightening effects of temporality. Temporality is the underlying issue in all these otherwise disparate examples. Despite a strong legacy of Romanticism, ruins remain relevant as emblems of transience. These fractured spaces offer a sense of mystery, whether melancholy or hopeful, that most ordinary, comfortable, and complete places lack. Ruins are palimpsests. We can mine the qualities of the layered temporalities for our own designs. This is not just about decay, but the manifold effects of time. Nature and next nature, including invitations to other life forms, are powerful ways to bring inert architecture to life. designing for time. While physical models express suspended temporality, animation allows for the simulation and acceleration of time, mapping effects of sunlight growth, scripted decay, and collapse. Like the work of Goldsworthy and other artists, architecture can be conceived with consideration of its life unfolding over time. Time is elusive, yet ever passing. Time is relative. Sorry. Time is elusive, yet ever passing. Time is relative. Time flees, but leaves its mark. Intangible, time forever changes the tangible. Our mortality heightens the preciousness of time. Perhaps like an organism, artificial or natural or somewhere in between, architecture can live its life out freely. Free to weather, to erode, to decay, to be overgrown, to be reborn, to be unexpected and imperfect. There is a preoccupation with static images in current practice. I propose a shift. Let us not be ruled by the tyranny of the image and consider designing with layered temporalities and cycles in mind. Moments, days, seasons, years, decades, and perhaps even centuries or millennia. In cases in which it is not appropriate to build long-lasting structures, the changes over time may be accelerated, like in Raspberry Fields, to fit the more ephemeral. While the cult of age value is now over 100 years old, it holds value in new interpretations. Technologies are rapidly evolving, but decay is still inherent and issues of temporality significant. As I move forward and away from the freedom and support of an academic studio, I hope to design not only with a vision of completed construction, but how architecture may age in interesting, even if unexpected ways. I believe architecture can produce new meanings and visceral experiences through the thoughtful consideration of temporality. Diderot wrote, "Ruins are the memento mori of civilizations, a reminder that the apparent permanence of architecture is illusory. Everything perishes, everything passes, only the world remains, only time endures." Architecture is not exempt from temporality. In this way, it can connect to something deeply human. Let us design